This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there. Better late than never, I suppose. Hey, this is the only episode I will be producing this week, and I apologize for that, but I had the great privilege of filling in for my friend Bill Cawley on his radio show, and that's always a good time. It's fun to get out of my house. It's fun to escape my little padded cell, which is what I call my studio, and to get out into the real world, talk to real listeners, talk to real people, drive in a real car. No, actually, I prefer working from home, but it was good to have a little bit of a break. But unfortunately, it also adds a little bit of stress to my schedule, and I'm sorry if I sound lazy, but I just didn't have it in me to sit down and produce a show for those days I filled in for him. And yesterday, when I was thinking I would get an episode produced, I had a couple of other things that came up that were high priority that needed to be taken care of. So, sorry, this is the only one this week, but there's a lot going on. And look, I'm going to apologize right up front because I have a sense that I'm probably going to be more focused on some negative things today than I typically am. And it just has more to do with the news cycle than the fact that, I'm playing Eeyore and everything sucks. And no, there's a lot going on. And I know right now there are a ton of people talking about the presidential debate last night. Now, you probably already heard, and I didn't watch it. I didn't watch it all the way through. I actually tuned in for about 5 minutes, and then I was just like, okay, I can't take this. And for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was all about power. And this is how presidential debates always are. No one ever talks about principles. No one ever talks about why government should be limited or why government exists in the first place. There's never a presumption of, hey, should this power even be exercised by the federal government or by the president in the first place? No, it's just about, well, who's going to exercise the power in whatever way, as if we have already agreed that, yes, it's all legitimate, and, it's just a matter of divvying it up and whoever gets to utilize it. But it was a disaster. And I'm a little bit torn because how many of us have been noticing this for years? That Joe Biden was in decline. I do not like Joe Biden. I think he's a despicable individual. And I think his political career has shown many times where he really is one of those despicable people in power that it's very, very hard to feel any kind of empathy for. But I don't know how Trump won't pick up a 34th and maybe a 35th felony for what was done to Joe Biden. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but I witnessed a murder. I witnessed elder abuse, but actually, Trump wasn't the one behind it. It's the handlers behind Biden. And this is the thing that's a little bit scary to me. And I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm preaching fear. It could not be more clear that we have been dealing with a man who is the president of the United States, most popular one ever, so we heard. And there was absolutely no possibility that there was anything wonky about the way in which he was brought into office. This guy is not in control of his faculties. Not even close. And it was sad to watch. And what was even sadder was immediately afterwards, and this is where I really started to get concerned, the talking heads on MSNBC, on CNN, they weren't having a tearful old yeller moment. I mean, they were acting like it, but the panic that they were showing, the tears of, well, that didn't go well, and we're going to have to replace him. How could this not have been in the works all along? I guess what I'm saying is, maybe I'm being a little too suspicious here, but I think last night was a setup to throw him under the bus so that they can bring in whoever their ringer's going to be, Michelle Obama, Gavin Newsom, whoever, to replace Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. It couldn't be more clear. There is no way Biden would beat Trump in an election, not with the performance that we saw last night. And yet, this is, I don't want to sit there and I don't want to pile on to Biden's woes. It was sad what happened to him. It was sad to see, the breakdown in this guy. He couldn't even finish a statement without losing his coherence or losing his way. Here's the thing that I'm focusing on. I want you to remember how hard the mainstream media, the legacy media, the press has lied to us over the years about the president's mental fitness. And I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. In fact, I want to go back. This is just from 12 days ago, when there was a fair amount of damage control going on about now, people who are talking about the president and, worried that he's not going to do well in this debate. Let me remind you, he's the greatest president ever. But please, don't take my word for it. This is from Tom Elliott, who put together a supercut of MSM commentators standing up for the president. It's about 3 minutes long. Check it out.
Start your tape right now, because I'm about to tell you the truth. And F you if you can't handle the truth. This version of Biden is the best Biden ever.
She knows so long as she was denied.
In fact, I think he's better than he's ever been.
President Biden has a photographic memory. His understanding and mastery of a complicated geopolitical situation, remarkable.
He is sharp, intensely probing, and detail-oriented and focused.
Jackie, are you here? Where's Jackie? I didn't think she was going to be here.
I was sitting, 2 feet from him across the table, and he was, intense.
Have trouble walking sometimes? Yeah, so did FDR. He wanted GD war.
But he's totally focused. He's very sharp.
They say he's sharp in meetings and so on.
Very lucid, very well informed. Biden is stately, and he comes with gravitas. There hasn't been, as far as I know, a single claim that Biden made a mistake.
Ageism is an issue. Americans have a rich history of holding people's physical characteristics against them. Okay, you can ask African Americans.
He's older. That doesn't mean that he is unfit, and there's a lot of ageism there.
Now, this age attack, this obsession by the right.
Joe Biden may not be able to speak for himself the way that he used to.
They want to think to take on government if we get out of line, which they're talking again about, and that's him lying around.
I think people should be speaking up for Joe Biden.
Americans and reporters in the media are just judging him by a physical appearance, and it's horribly unfair. Age is an asset.
He showed exactly how with it he is.
The flip side of this coin is that he has a tremendous amount of wisdom and experience.
Have you heard any concerns from anyone who has met with President Biden about him seeming a little slower?
No.
More wild speculation from a bunch of people who have probably never been in a room with Joe Biden and certainly don't have medical degrees that I'm aware of.
You don't get paid for performance to be president. The job is not a job of endurance. I don't see Donald Trump out bike riding like Joe Biden.
It's the Hillary's email. All they have is that he's old.
He can clear a dementia bar, and that's probably a win.
The media are not fair, and they're getting less and less fair, and things are frightening. You have Wall Street Journal running a horribly sourced piece saying that Biden is unfit.
Dubious Wall Street Journal report about the president's acuity.
Shoddy story by the Wall Street Journal questioning Biden's mental fitness.
Wall Street Journal story had a lot of flaws, as you said. But Sinclair, they didn't do any original reporting. They didn't follow up. They didn't do any work.
The hero of today is Hirsch Goldberg Poland, and it's still... He is not here with us, but he's still being held by Hamas.
But a huge part of the Mueller report talks about Russian disinformation tactics. And one of the themes this election cycle is that Joe Biden is too old to lead. And so everyone is seizing upon this. And it is a classic disinformation tactic. And I think the best thing that we can do is to prepare the American people for this false narrative.
Liars. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I won't watch more than just a minute or two of mainstream news coverage, because I don't like the contempt that starts to well up in my heart when I see the lengths to which these individuals are willing to go to lie to our faces about what's going on. By the way, this includes even formerly respectable sites. KSL, for instance. This KSL used to be the premier news organization in the Intermountain West. And even their headline yesterday, which I'm sorry, it was crazy to see them do this, but their headline that they gave for the debate, they deleted it. They took it away. Wow. I was just going to pull it up here on X, but basically it said, a raspy Biden, fends off attacks from Trump, who spouted falsehoods. It's like, guys, I don't know how to tell you this, but it's pretty hard to spin the fact that the president of the United States fell apart like a soup sandwich right there in front of everybody. I don't know what to say other than it's a sad day. It is a very sad day, and it's kind of a dangerous time because now the people who are looking to fill that vacuum of power are, they're likely to do whatever it takes. And frankly, from what we've seen before, that could include a lot of very dangerous possibilities. Sorry to start on a negative note.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Again, I'm kind of amazed. I went back on Twitter to take a look at that KSL headline, and they deleted it. They must have got ratioed pretty hard. I was one of the first people to comment on that particular post, and it must not have gone well. But, this is the same news organization that in the last week has made a point, and at this point I think it's gratuitous to tell us about this woman in southern Utah who murdered her parents, and it's a transsexual man. It's a guy who identifies as a woman, who is transitioning to a woman, and I don't understand why we put pronouns above public safety, but when there was a police manhunt going on, and I don't know if we can use the word manhunt any longer because it's probably considered non-inclusive, but the St. George Police Department, as well as much of the media, have all decided that, if someone says that they identify, if this is what their identity is, their gender identity, we are duty-bound, we are honor-bound to bend the knee to them and acknowledge them as they wish to be acknowledged. But here's the problem. Okay, so you have a murder suspect, and this was, I think, a week ago Tuesday night. An individual... And I've got to say this, a mentally disturbed individual murdered his parents, shot through a door, tried to kill his brother. His brother thankfully escaped. And I believe the Washington City Police accurately reported that this individual that they were seeking, Colin Bailey, that's what he was born as. Now he identifies as, I can't read, is it Mia? Mia Bailey? Anyway, they referred to him as a transsexual man transitioning to female, or male transitioning to female. And they used a couple of different photos. One of them where he's presenting more masculine, one where he's presenting more like a woman. And I have to admit, Bailey made a pretty convincing woman. But they issue this alert saying, okay, people, we have an armed, dangerous suspect on the loose. A violent murder, 2 violent murders have been committed. And yet, when St. George Police Department released their report, or their alert, again, telling people shelter in place and be on the lookout, they kept referring to her parents. She murdered her parents, and she is being sought. So everybody's thinking, we're looking for a woman. Eric Moutsos, who I count as a good friend, and he's a resident there in St. George, talked with an individual who was interviewed by KSL, and this individual had been talking to the reporter and said, look, we had a friend who was in that neighborhood, right there in the neighborhood, saw a guy walking in between the house lots, and didn't think anything of it because it was a guy. After all, they're looking for a woman. So she didn't say anything. I mean, do you see the problem here? And of course, KSL, it was very interesting. Their reporter told this individual that they were talking with, it's likely we're not going to be able to air this part of the interview. Well, why is that? Because we don't want to offend anybody. Okay, now, as much as it may sound like, oh boy, you're really on the stump here about this whole transgender issue, that's not the issue, okay? Focus. Let's bring it back. It's about reality. It's about truth. And it's about when there is an armed, dangerous suspect on the loose. That's not the time to be politically correct. That's not the time to demonstrate your empathy and your wokeness. So why would a professional organization like the police department, like St. George Police Department, put pronouns above public safety? And again, it's not a hypothetical. There were people confused. They didn't know that it was actually a suspect who was born as a male and could be presenting as a male that police were looking for. And now we got this kind of gratuitous thing where anytime, the news organizations, the mainstream news organizations in Utah report on it, they're, well, she and her and blah, 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 they're all caught up in it. Maybe it's Pride Month. I don't know. Maybe it's their own pride. I think more than anything, they're just trying to rub it in people's faces about this is how it's going to be. Now, here's what I'm not asking you to do. Don't get on the phone and, give them an angry call. Don't send angry emails or letters to them. I'm just going to ask you, evaluate for yourself why you would trust such organizations with any information if they are willing to bend reality to fit some agenda, whatever that agenda may be. In this case, it happens to be a particularly destructive, anti-human agenda, but it could be anything. But if they're that willing to lie to you to your face, why would you trust them on anything? You have the option of withdrawing your patronage, withdrawing your consent. Do it. There are plenty of other sources out there from which you can get a take on what's going on in the world. And frankly, much of what the news media is reporting on isn't that important anyway. I mean, we're led to believe that the most important thing in the world is whatever's happening in politics. Look, it's not completely irrelevant, but in my day-to-day life, you know what the most important thing is to me? The happiness and well-being of my family. Politics can play a small role in that, but for the most part, we secure our happiness by keeping politics and government at any level as distant as possible, arm's length. So that's where I choose to put my focus. I'm sorry, I really feel like I'm on a rant today, and this is from a guy who's been very actively trying to avoid negativity or feeding fear or anger. But I feel like the stakes have actually kind of raised in the last 24 hours. Partly because the facade that was put up, and I'm going to go back here to the Joe Biden topic for just a moment. The facade that, the president of the United States is perfectly competent. What kind of things are being done right now by the White House in the name of the people of the United States of America that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the puppet that was installed in 2021? How could anybody who is just the tiniest bit rational not doubt the official version that, the 2020 election was just fine? The only people I hear really spouting that line and really vigorously objecting to any questions are the people in power or the people who are seeking power. That should tell us something. It's not about principle. It's not about right and wrong. It's about power. And these are the same people who, at least the ones who are holding those levers of power, are steering us into a head-on collision with Russia, most likely with China as well. But they've thrown every provocation out there that they can. They're actively helping Ukraine, targeting Russian civilians, using U.S. weapons, using U.S., what's the word I'm looking for? Intelligence and data from U.S. drones and reconnaissance satellites. I'm not wishing for anything bad to happen, but how can we avoid the consequences of the kind of things that are being done? I don't think we can. And there's going to be a sad day when those chickens will come home to roost. I'm not going to be cheering, but you'll have to forgive me if I'm, not quite strong enough to keep from saying, I freaking told you so. And I'm not the only one. There are so many voices that have spoken up on this. Now, again, it's not a matter of, boy, if we just get angry enough, maybe we can change this. Look, the things that are set in motion, I don't know that we have the power to change. The one thing we can change is how will we react to it? What kind of people are you and I going to be? I, for one, am going to be the kind of person who withdraws his consent from those who are abusing their power. And I will do everything in my power to convince other people to do likewise, while simultaneously working on my own character and my own inner workings to become the best person I can possibly become. Their artificial rules will have nothing to do with me because I will govern myself. I'm encouraging you to do the same thing.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. So I know a lot of eyes have been on the Supreme Court this week, especially the last couple of days, because they've been dropping those hot takes, their decisions on various high-profile cases. And there are a number of cases that we could talk about, but there's one in particular, and this was the Murthy v. Missouri case. This was an important one because this is where it was alleged and a lawsuit was filed showing that the Biden administration was directly influencing these large social media companies to suppress certain points of view. Right? So it's third-hand censorship, but it's still censorship. And the Supreme Court, apparently, they have rejected a lower court's injunction against many government agencies that were leaning on social media companies to curate content. And they did this. This is the technicality. Well, the plaintiffs lack standing. I think this is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court refused to hear many of the cases that were brought about the 2020 election. Well, we can't really show that you're the one who is being harmed, so you lack standing. I think it's cowardice. I think they didn't want to take a stand. But here we are. Censorship has been greenlit. Now, this is an article from the Brownstone Institute. I don't know who the author is, but here's the gist of what happens with this decision. In 1919, the Supreme Court used the pretext of crisis to overhaul the First Amendment as it jailed critics of the Great War, World War I. Over a century later, the court has again fallen victim to the Beltway's prevailing zeitgeist in today's regrettable decision, Murthy v. Missouri. The court's opinion, written by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, rejects the lower court's injunction against many government agencies to stop leaning on social media companies to curate content, and does so on the grounds that the plaintiffs lack standing. Now, the opinion rests on omitted facts, skewed perceptions, and absurd conclusory statements. The dissent, issued by Justice Samuel Alito and joined by Justices Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, masterfully recounts the facts of the case and the inconsistency of the majority. Justice Barrett's opinion completely ignored the court's decision last week in National Rifle Association v. Volo. In that case, the court held that New York officials violated the NRA's First Amendment rights by launching a campaign to coerce private actors to punish or suppress the NRA's gun promotion activities. Justice Sotomayor issued the opinion for a unanimous court, writing, "Government officials cannot attempt to coerce private parties in order to punish or suppress views that the government disfavors." Now, in Murthy, the majority did not even attempt to differentiate the case from its clear precedent in Volo. Justice Alito, however, explained the ominous message the court sent through the two opinions. Quote, "What the officials did in this case was more subtle than the ham-handed censorship found to be unconstitutional in Volo, but it was no less coercive. And because of the perpetrators' high positions, it was even more dangerous. It was blatantly unconstitutional, and the country may come to regret the court's failure to say so. Officials who read today's decision together with Volo will get the message. If a coercive campaign is carried out with enough sophistication, it may get by." End quote. Now, the article goes on to say the majority opinion is bereft of references to the perpetrators, their high positions, or their statements of coercion. Justice Barrett doesn't mention Rob Flaherty, or Andy Slavitt, the two main henchmen behind the Biden administration's censorship efforts. She doesn't mention them once in her holding. The dissent, however, devotes pages to recounting the White House's ongoing censorship campaign. Justice Alito used the framework outlined in Volo, which the majority likewise ignored, which analyzed 4 factors in determining whether government communications violate the First Amendment. 1, word choice and tone. 2, the existence of regulatory authority. 3, whether the speech was perceived as a threat. And more importantly, 4, whether the speech refers to adverse consequences. Now, last week, the Brownstone Institute addressed how those 4 factors clearly demonstrate that the government violated the First Amendment in Murthy. Today's dissent used similar framework and similar arguments. Alito cited how the White House's emails were phrased virtually as orders, and the officials' frequent follow-ups ensured that they were understood as such. Justice Barrett's majority opinion relied on the presumption that social media companies already support censorship, so she could not find that the government's speech was the cause of the injury. But this deliberately strayed from the precedent that the court set just last week in Volo. Second, Alito explained that social media companies are far more vulnerable to government pressure than other news sources. He wrote, if a president dislikes a particular newspaper, he fortunately lacks the ability to put the paper out of business. But for Facebook and many other social media platforms, the situation is fundamentally different. They are critically dependent on the protection provided by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which shields them from civil liability for content they spread. And he then cited Mark Zuckerberg, who said the threat of antitrust lawsuits was an existential threat to his company. This creates an all-encompassing regulatory authority that demands subservience from social media companies. The majority, however, only mentions this existential threat in passing, noting that Jen Psaki spoke generally about Section 230 and antitrust reform in July 2021 amid White House pressure to promote vaccine censorship. But evidently, Barrett and the rest of the majority did not feel inclined to address the issues that Justice Alito raised in dissent. Now, Justice Alito, citing the facts that the majority ignored, explained, quote, for these and other reasons, internet platforms have a powerful incentive to please important federal officials. And the record in this case shows that high-ranking officials skillfully exploited Facebook's vulnerability. When Facebook did not heed their requests as quickly or as fully as the officials wanted, the platform was publicly accused of killing people and subtly threatened with retaliation. End quote. Now, third, Alito noted that executives' responses to persistent inquiries, criticisms, and threats show that the platform perceived the statements as something more than mere recommendations. Like Brownstone's analysis from last week, Justice Alito cited reports from the House Judiciary Committee that reveal Facebook officials kowtowed to Flaherty and Slavitt within hours of their demands. Perhaps most absurdly, the court ruled there was no substantial risk of future injury because the government has winded down its frequent intense communications with the platforms. The majority wrote it is no more than conjecture that plaintiffs will be subject to censorship in the future. Ha! Wow. But as we enter another election year, can Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, or Justice Kavanaugh honestly think that these agencies like CISA, the CIA, the FBI, DHS will temper their censorship efforts now that the court has absolved them? Will they allow dissent to flourish over the conflict in Ukraine, vaccine mandates, the rise of bird flu, or corruption allegations after they have successfully stifled dissidents in their last cycle? The Brownstone Institute says the glorious achievement of the internet was to give everyone a voice. Social media made that operational, and as time has gone on, government has found a way in via direct intimidation and third-party services, plus revolving doors with agencies. So the majority opinion here has found a way to codify this new form of censorship that threatens the whole idea of free speech itself. Now the case returns to the lower court for further examination, which will lead to more discovery and more evidence of government control of speech. Meanwhile, the range of views available to influence the public mind will grow ever more narrow over time, and the First Amendment could become a dead letter. Now, I know that may seem, well, some kind of, defeatist in their thinking, but that's the harsh reality. Censorship has been given more or less a free hand. Again, as long as it's sophisticated enough, it just can't be blatant. Well, the government says you can't say that. But government officials can, through backdoor communications, influence those social media companies and the people in charge of them with threats of, intense regulation or some other form of administrative punishment or regulatory punishment, and get them to do the dirty work. I don't know. Maybe we've been spending too much time on social media in the first place. Maybe this is that good excuse to cut those ties and move on. But man, if you need to get information or you need to make connections, it's been a very helpful tool. I guess my point here is communicating the truth is not getting much easier. In fact, when we come back in the next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we have officially shifted into a situation where telling the truth is considered a crime. Case in point, Julian Assange, freed from Belmarsh prison. He's back home. He's a free man in Australia, but not before the United States government worked out a plea deal with him and forced him to confess to a crime that he did not commit. Yeah, the founder of Wikileaks took the plea deal, and I mean, can you blame him? How many years has he been sitting in prison unjustly, accused of espionage, which, is I believe a capital offense. So they offered him an out. He took it, but in order to do so, he had to say, yes, I committed this crime, when in fact he did no such thing. Such interesting times that we live in. Not for the faint-hearted, to be sure.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Final segment of this week's one and only episode. But I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to at least get this episode out there. I'm so sorry. I have been on a tear today, but I've seen some things here that have really caught my attention, and I'm very passionate about these things. And above all, I'm encouraging you, please, do not lower your awareness. Do not let your guard down. If there was ever a time to pay attention, to get yourself right with your Creator, and to strengthen your position of self-reliance. And I mean that in the temporal sense. I mean that spiritually. I mean in the emotional sense. The people around you, strengthen those bonds. Because what's been kind of a bumpy ride here the last few years, I think is going to get a whole lot rougher. We're up to this, but we're going to have to endure. We're going to have to be resilient to make it through this. Let's talk a little bit about America's dark day. This is from Scott Ritter and pertains to Julian Assange. He says, by allowing the U.S. government to compel Julian Assange to plead guilty to a crime he did not commit, America has condemned itself to a land where telling the truth is a crime. Now, he starts with a quote here from Justice Hugo Black, New York Times versus the United States, 1971. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. So Julian Assange was scheduled, and I believe this has already happened, to appear before a U.S. court on the island of Saipan, where he's expected to plead guilty to a single violation of the Espionage Act, namely conspiring to obtain and disclose national defense information. Scott Ritter says, look, Assange is guilty of no crime. It is the United States which operates in violation of law, and by suppressing Julian Assange's duty as a publisher to expose deception on the part of government about war crimes committed by American service members in Iraq and other lies and deceptions perpetuated by the State Department and the Department of Defense in gross disregard for the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Now, by subjecting Assange to 5 years of imprisonment under horrific conditions in a British maximum security prison, where he was held under solitary confinement 23 hours a day, the U.S. government broke the spirit and will of a man whose cause had come to personify, the fundamental issue of free speech. The UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, Juan E. Mendez, has declared that solitary confinement as a punishment cannot be justified for any reason, precisely because it imposes severe mental pain and suffering beyond any reasonable retribution for criminal behavior, and thus constitutes an act defined as torture. Ritter says every American, whether they operate as a journalist or simply a citizen who believes in the fundamental right of free speech and a free press, must understand the significance of what Assange's plea deal means. It is a frontal assault on free speech, effectively overturning the landmark Supreme Court decision in the New York Times versus the United States that spawned Hugo Black's words in defense of this basic American freedom. So Scott Ritter says, let there be no doubt, Julian Assange is free, but free speech and the notion of a free press is dead in America today. Killed by our collective passivity in the face of the brutalization of Julian Assange by the U.S. government for the crime of exposing their crimes for all the world to see. The truth no longer sets us free. Rather, shining light on the inconvenient truth has become a crime. And he says America is a far worse place today than it was before our government compelled this plea agreement from Julian Assange. This is a dark day in the history of our country. And I know this is kind of a tough one in the sense that not everybody sees Assange as a hero. People who have read a few too many Tom Clancy novels may, he endangered American lives. But I promise you, out-of-control government is a far greater threat than the embarrassing secrets which came to light because of Wikileaks, thanks to whistleblowers leaking information. There's literal blood on the hands of many of these government officials through the orders that they have given. Why would you not want to know when your government is acting beyond its legitimate responsibilities? This is that deal with the devil that Jacob Hornberger talks about with the national security state. Well, we made that deal with the devil to keep us safe. How's that working out for us? Not so great, right? Right, one final note. This is an article from Brandon Smith. And again, I do not want to promote fear, but I think this is a good time for heightened awareness. We are entering a new and dangerous phase of late empire. And that danger stems from panic on the part of those in power who are desperate to stay in control. Now, Brandon Smith comes right out and says the odds are high that you're going to need your survival supplies in the next few years. I'll just share a couple excerpts from his article here. He says, in 2020, at the onset of the COVID pandemic scare and right before the lockdowns, I'll never forget going on a grocery run on a Friday afternoon, only to find near empty roads and near empty stores. The few other people shopping had a glassy stare in their eyes like they were dazed or shell-shocked. He says, for me and those I know who prep, it was just another day. For those that hadn't prepped, it was a nightmare of uncertainty. Now, he says, in Montana, we didn't pay much heed to the lockdowns after the first month. In 3 months, everything was basically back to normal, except for the mask mandates, which most people ignored. But with more data available on the virus, it was clear that the chance of death was greatly exaggerated. What scared us far more was the pervasive talk of vaccine passports in 2021. The proposed federal and state restrictions on people that refused to take the jab were familiar. That was the beginning of full-blown tyranny unless we stood firm. In the meantime, there was a public rush to buy up as many necessities as they could afford. And of course, the COVID stimulus measures helped to trigger a stagflationary crisis that had already been building in America for many years. In the face of so many potential threats, preppers were still well protected. If vaccine passports became the norm and access to public places were blocked, well, then we had food storage to get us through for a long time to come. If the buying panic and inflation led to a supply chain disaster, well, we were ready with the guns and ammo and training needed to keep what we had. If a fight was coming, then we had the means to defend ourselves. Well, he says, I've been long convinced it was the prepper factor that caused the government to rethink their strategy of perpetual medical lockdowns and give up on vaccine passports. Recent surveys show that over 30% of the U.S. population is involved in prepping. We're an unknown element, something they can't predict, a possible monkey wrench in the gears of the machine. With our own supplies, we're not dependent on the system to keep us alive, and the harder they push, the more we are compelled to organize into an even greater obstacle. Just as NATO sanctions pushed Russia, China, and the BRICS closer together, openly authoritarian policies in the West during COVID pushed liberty movement people together. So the establishment backed away because they had to. He says, that's why I laugh whenever I see some idiot online say, what's the point of prepping when nothing ever happens? These people must have been living under a rock since 2020. We just dodged one of the biggest Orwellian bullets in our nation's history with the defeat of the pandemic mandates. Or maybe they don't realize that the pandemic was just the beginning. He says, if that's the case, then it pains me to remind everyone that nothing has fundamentally changed. Yes, we beat back the mandates, but the same elites, all the same elites, are still in power. All the same globalist institutions that exploited COVID to create a panic still exist. And the event has acted as a domino in a chain leading to other crises. And then he gives some reasons why you're definitely going to need your survival preps in the next few years. He talks about the stagflation crisis that wouldn't die. Political riots are assured. The war in Ukraine is about to become a world war. The war over Gaza is quickly leading to a war for the Middle East. And he ends by reminding us that prepping isn't a hobby, it is a duty. Think of food storage like a big battery. A battery is for energy storage for later when you need it. Think about how much time and work and energy goes into growing just 1 month of food for your family. Isn't it far better to store all that work in long-term food so you don't have to worry about it later during the worst of conditions? Every bucket of stored food is a battery that saves you precious time and labor. Look, his point is there are too many variables around the world right now that could cause catastrophe. Even events on the other side of the globe can cause serious problems for us here at home. Brandon Smith says, I see very little chance of the situation improving in the next few years and a very high chance of things spiraling out of control. Take your prepping seriously, even when oblivious naysayers claim nothing's going to happen. He says those same people will be crying for help before long, and you don't want to share their fate.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.